For this episode, I traveled to Morija to meet someone who has spent decades digging into the history and heritage of this country and sharing it in his writings. This episode is in conversation with Stephen Gill. Stephen Gill is a historian and writer, an American-born naturalized Mosotho who has dedicated his life to understanding, preserving, and telling the story of Lesotho and its people. Stephen Gill served as curator of Morija Museum and Archives for 33 years, from 1989 to 2022. In those 30-plus years, he transformed the institution into one of the most notable archival repositories in the region. He secured important partnerships that helped the preservation of irreplaceable historical documents, including the digitization of 12,000 pages of archival material, as well as the preservation of 149 years of one of Africa's oldest surviving newspapers. His published works include the celebrated A Short History of Lesotho, A Guide to Morija, The Story of Morija Museum and Archives, and Museums Lesotho. He is currently working on a new work that explores the life and legacy of Morena Lerotodi. Stephen Gill lives in Morija, where he divides his time between writing and research, as well as working with Siriti Samakharani, an institution dedicated to the preservation of the heritage and culture of the Makharane region. I sat down with Stephen Gill in the historic town of Morija, one of the earliest towns in this country, richly steeped in history and heritage. And we talked. We talked for the better part of the day. This was not our first conversation, but what you're about to hear today is different. This time we dig deep into the foundations of our nation, and we go beyond that. We ask the question, who were the founders of this nation? Who were the clans, the nations, the peoples who gathered at the Coloureds River basin? What were the conditions of that time? What was the spirit of the age? And what were the circumstances that led to the final forging of our nation? This is the SSMPodcast series. To support it, please like, share, hit the notification button, and click the links in the description. Stephen Gill, welcome. One of the major events that define the Basotho nation is Difaqane, the times of trouble, wars of King Shaka Senzangakona. How exactly do they impact Basotho as different polities and as a whole? And how does that shape the resulting Basotho nation?
There were two, or if we might even say three, separate regional dynamics which influence heavily the context of nation building south of the Vaal River in the greater Lesotho Free State area. Yes, you do have the Difaqane, the upheaval, but even before that starts, there are important developments in the Western Cape, moving into the Eastern Cape, moving into the Northern Cape, first of people of color, people of mixed origin, the descendants of white settlers, the Khoi, slaves, and other groups who become acculturated increasingly towards that of the white settlers. They have horses, they have guns, they wear oftentimes what might be called Western style clothing. They move especially up the West Coast and then through the lower Orange River Valley into what is now the Northern Cape. And because they have horses and guns and these other attributions or technologies of of the settlers, they're able to dominate indigenous groups from those areas. And it's not long before they are themselves followed by the very white settlers. Now, these white settlers don't concentrate on the West Coast because it's so arid and, in some respects, inhospitable. But they do come up through the Eastern Cape, and because of their habit or their thirst for land, we called them farmers, but actually they were, in American terms, they were ranchers. They didn't do a lot of plowing, but they had cattle, sheep, goats, and they took huge tracts of land, 6,000 acres at a time, sometimes more, because you can imagine that in many parts of the Cape, it's also arid. And so the amount of territory that African peoples would use would be so much more limited than that of the white settlers. Africans always practiced a mix of field agriculture, herding, as well as hunting and gathering. It's not to say that the Dutch settlers, Dutch, French, German settlers, didn't have a mixed approach, but they were primarily concerned with herding and the market for selling that toward Cape Town. And that's how they survived. And so they took these massive plots of land, as I say, 6,000 acres at a time. And it didn't take long to fill these places up, you can imagine. And of course, the land was taken from other indigenous peoples. Now, at the beginning, it was the Khoi and the San, or the Bar, or the Bushmen, who lost their land. But increasingly, as they moved into the Eastern Cape, they started taking land also from Xhosa-speaking people. And it wasn't long, already in 1786, they established the small little dorp of Grafreinet, which was then in the far northeastern sections of the Cape. By 1820, they had basically filled themselves up to the Orange River and were already tempted to go over the Orange River. I mean, the expansion, it's not that there were tens of thousands of these people, but because they took such large expanses of land, it could only accommodate so many. And in the process, that land had previously basically been Bushman land. The whole of the territory to the south and north of the Orange River was basically Bushman land, all the way to what is now Matatiele and the borders of KwaZulu. With time, these white settlers basically disappropriated most of that land from the Bushmen. It took time, but they took it. Now, you can imagine that you've got this force coming up from the southwest. At the same time, there are these amazing developments taking place in what is now northern Natal, where first under Dingizwayo, and then the Ndwandwe and others, you find this intense competition, a competition/amalgamation. Dingizwayo, in some accounts, is projected as a man who prefers peaceful methods of amalgamation. At the same time, he can be extremely brutal when necessary. And clearly, he wanted to amalgamate people peacefully, but if they didn't cooperate, too bad for them. Zwide became his major competitor and was even more brutal. Zwide is able to capture and kill Dingizwayo. And this is when emerges this young general, Shaka Zulu, who arises out of nowhere, in a sense, to become this Napoleon of Southern Africa. And what has happened is that the traditional military tactics are now transformed. In the Free State Lesotho area, you don't really have wars. You have raids. You have cattle raids. You have tribute being paid. You have alliances. But it's all relatively peaceful and nonviolent, comparatively speaking. What's happening in northern Natal is something on an extraordinarily different level, where now you develop standing armies. I mean, the Sotho and the Tswana, they didn't have standing armies. They had, let's call them age cohorts. People who went through the initiation ceremonies together formed a cohort, and they would then protect their people. And of course, because you had a number of cohorts based on age, each community had its own protection.
So Shaka's army as an institution is a different development.
It's different development altogether, because now you don't, in fact, they even do away with initiation. Initiation is now seen to be an impediment toward military prowess and state formation. Now, of course, today people think that's extraordinary. How could the Zulu not practice initiation? But that's exactly what happened. They did away with initiation, and they delayed marriage. For a time, men could only get married in their late 30s and early 40s because they were compelled. They were compelled to serve in the army up until a certain age, and only thereafter could they start a family. Completely revolutionary. Completely.
Fascinating character, Shaka, because we know that Thomas Mofolo dedicated a lot of his research writing to Basotho. What were some of the things that led to the emergence of the person Chaka or Shaka? How do we end up with this Napoleon of Southern Africa?
This is so difficult to accurately understand. Mofolo has painted such a convincing picture of Shaka in his novel that at times you almost believe that this creative output of Mofolo is actually history, when in fact it's not to say that Mofolo was trying to create a caricature, but he was using his basic research from Natal to try and explore certain philosophical and theological issues through Shaka as a historical figure. And so for us to say that the novel is a correct representation of Shaka, I think would be an overstatement.
But the driving motivations themselves, you've worked with some of the heritage that is associated with Thomas Mofolo, not just Chaka, but some other works. And perhaps you would understand really what motivations would drive him. He was a man of his times. He was in this town, if I'm not mistaken, in Morija, when he wrote Chaka.
Well, at least the early part of Chaka was written here, after which he left and ended up in Tiatiani. Chaka was only published in 1925, and that was 15 years after he left Morija. The manuscript which he wrote was very controversial. There were some missionaries who felt that the book had such a dark ethos, as it describes Shaka Zulu, that it might actually promote paganism or some kind of wrong thinking if we may put it that way. Fortunately, Alfred Casalas, who was the manager of the book depot and the printing works, was a man of greater insight, perhaps, broader perspective. And he said, no, this is a work of genius. And yes, it explores things which are very dark and perhaps we could say very challenging. Nonetheless, it's something that needs to be broadcast widely. And so he made that decision. And after the book was published, he then resigned. But the book, of course,
It was
out.
controversial.
And it was extremely controversial, but also it was recognized from the beginning by many, many others as a truly creative work of genius, something that Southern Africa had never seen before. And most amazingly, because it was written in Sesotho. Already South African intellectuals were publishing in English, but Mofolo chose to write in Sesotho, and in the most beautiful and eloquent Sesotho, which set such a high standard that his book was, for example, it became a set book among the Bapedi, among the Batswana, and other, call them Sotho-speaking groups in Southern Africa, because it was so extraordinary in its portrayal, in its use of language, in the themes that it explored. So yes, Mofolo, the book was published 100 years ago, but I think people even today would agree that it set such a high standard that it may even today be recognized as the most influential of all books ever published in Sesotho.
How much is Thomas Mofolo following through the Western intellectual tradition in this work, even if it's in Sesotho? Because this is the making of a myth. This is perhaps Alexander the Great, Genghis Khan. The idea that the historical person themselves can be presented in our memory in a particular way, but this is a high work of art. And so it will be presented in this Homeric kind of way. How much is he influenced by the Christian ideas that were prevailing amongst the people at that time?
You know, if you look at his earlier works, like Moetiwabo Chabela or Pitseng, you can clearly recognize the legacy which he has digested for himself from the missionaries. But when you look at Shaka Zulu, it becomes now far more complex, because it's almost as if he's now part of a psychoanalytical school, as opposed to necessarily being a propagator of some kind of Christian orientation. This is why his work was so controversial, because it was not necessarily Christian. Yes, it may have been influenced broadly by certain understandings which might have derived from the West, but which equally probably derived from his own African culture and background. And so, as I say, it's almost more psychoanalytical than it is necessarily Christian. And I suppose this is one reason why the book has endured, because if it was merely seen as a Christian tract of sorts, it would have long ago faded in terms of its influence. But it retains that influence even now. I think that what historians have to wrestle with is that it's not to say that there is not historical evidence and material which can be used to build a portrait of Shaka Zulu as a living, historic human being. We know, for example, that he was the illegitimate offspring of a chief.
Before we go back to Stephen Gill, a word about the organization behind this podcast. Siritusamakwarane Heritage and Tourism Network, SSM, is a community-based organization dedicated to understanding, preserving, restoring and presenting the history, heritage and living culture of the Greater Makwarane area. This is the region that includes Morija, known as the wellspring of learning, as well as the royal villages of Matien, Makeneng and Pameng. Our work spans heritage conservation, research and documentation, community leadership, digital archiving, and tourism development, all rooted in the belief that Lesotho must remember itself. Visit us at www.makwarane.com.
We know that as a child he suffered humiliation, and how would one say, that he grew up in a less than ideal home situation, that probably, as Mofolo suggests, there were deep contradictions within him which had to play out in a certain way, and that because of his intense and overwhelming need for recognition, he becomes the perfecter of these new military tactics and social strategies within his people, to the point that he's able to conquer I don't know how many tens or hundreds of thousands of people. And because of his conquests, many others who were defeated by him had to leave what is now northern Natal. Some coming into the highveld, into the Free State Lesotho area, some going up to Mozambique, Malawi, far and wide. We could say wreaking havoc wherever they went. Of course, they would have not said that. They would have said, we are also nation builders, so that the Hlubi who came into the highveld, the Ngwane, both of them settled in what had been the territory of Moshoeshoe. And of course, there was great upheaval because they also brought new military tactics with them. And because there was this intense competition between them, they were not only fighting amongst themselves, but they were also overwhelming the people who had been in the Caledon River Valley previous to that period.
The Shaka becomes an object of interest, a person of interest to Thomas Mofolo. And why was Mofolo not interested in pursuing or developing a myth around Moshoeshoe or a myth around Mhlomi? And perhaps there are differences between these two. So you talk of these brilliant military strategies, where most of Shaka's strategies his own inventions or adopted somewhere perfected, but mostly his inventions.
Certainly, Shaka's inventions or enhancements had started at least with Dingiswayo, but he took them further and amplified them, and through force of personality and through force imposed this on an ever-increasing number of people in Natal. He also had a policy which was later followed by Mzilikazi and others, of having what we might call a dead zone. So, for example, south of the Tugela River, and almost as far as what is now the Eastern Cape, there was tremendous depopulation because he didn't want any competition.
So dead zone means killing off.
Not killing off oil, but at least driving off.
Okay.
You know,
So you don't want any populations in those areas because they will naturally create regiments and they will create armies.
obviously we can exaggerate this. Obviously there were people there, but compared to the previous population densities, things had been greatly transformed. Now, Mzilikazi did the same thing when he was in what is now, let's say, Northwest Province, Gauteng. He also tended to drive people away so that there were these zones around him which were not devoid of people, but greatly reduced in terms of numbers. And of course, then this means that if we include then the policies of Mpangazita and Matuani in the Caledon River Valley, you now have people fleeing in all directions, literally in all directions. So, for example, the first records from the Eastern Cape show the entrance of strangers. And that's what they call them, strangers, because they don't know what label to put on them, arriving in the Eastern Cape in October of 1822. Now, you can imagine the upheaval probably began that very year in the Caledon River Valley. And already by late 1822, you already have people arriving not just in the Eastern Cape, but among the settlers, which means they've passed through the Bushman territories, they've passed through certain Xhosa-speaking territories. They're now actually in what is now the Cradock region. In those days, there were no cities like Cradock. It was called the Tarka, which was the name of a major river there. They're already penetrating as deep as the Tarka, and the settlers are asking themselves, who are these people? And at first they called them strangers, then they called them, the Bushmen called them Kus, or something like Kus. And then later they used the word Mantatis. They weren't actually Batlokwa, but because of the reputation of Mantatisi in the region, which became more widely known, then they called them Mantatis, they called them Fetkani. They had put all sorts of labels to these people because they didn't really know who they were. And so from late 1822, you have this increasing arrival of refugees from the Caledon River Valley in parts of the Eastern Cape, in the what is now the Western Free State, and of course much further north. You've got Sibetwani, a major leader of the Bafokeng from the Senekal area, who takes his people all the way up to Zambia. And all of this because of the discord, the violence, the upheaval which these invading groups bring.
I'm still stuck with these two stark images of these two leaders. One is a diplomat, so that's what we form as archetypes, and the other is a warrior. Could this be the form of Mofolo's obsession with one? Because I'm trying to see where Moshoeshoe emerges as a national myth.
You know, of course, Moshoeshoe emerged as a myth, let's say, in the process of becoming a leader. I think myth making is integral to nation building, and let's say the element of propaganda is there in all of these processes, almost from the very beginning. Of course, the myth may be molded and shaped over time in different ways, but I believe even today when we see famous people, they are already creating their stories as they go along. And it was no different in those days. Now, it's interesting to ask why Mofolo never seemed preoccupied with the Moshoeshoe myth. But unfortunately, I had the opportunity to interview his descendants, who are still based, some of them at TY. And it was said that he died in, if I remember, 1948. He was about 72 years of age at the time. It was said that after he died, the daughter-in-law, Hutukasusutu Unasheka, she cleaned house. And if there were personal papers, letters, other documents, which he had collected over the years, whatever the case may be, at least they didn't survive beyond that period. And so when we explore the life of Mofolo, one of the most frustrating aspects is that, unlike many writers and authors, there isn't a corpus of documentary evidence, journals, letters, and other material which is often attributed to writers, upon which we can draw in order to get a more complete understanding of him as the author and of the creative process. With Mofolo, we just unfortunately don't know.
Talking about Mofolo, one directly connects it to Morija, which also connects to Moshoeshoe's nation-building efforts. Why you have this literati and intelligentsia here. And I think Mofolo is just the most famous of them, and there were a number of them who emerged from this town. I want to understand exactly how Morija emerges, and as a town that's occupied by missionaries. And how did Moshoeshoe, I believe he sent his sons here to take care of the missionaries. How did that transpire, and what was the logic in around that, and how did that work out?
You know, there are very interesting stories which emerged from the early period of Moshoeshoe's time. After, first of all, the Ngwane overwhelm the Hlubi and become the paramount power in the Caledon River Valley. Moshoeshoe then, increasingly under pressure from Matiwane and his Ngwane, finds himself in a position where he is both, they affectionately, is it affection or is it derision or is it both? Talk about Moshoeshoe as my Musutwani, my little Musutu. And so for much of the period of the next few years, Matiwane almost protects Moshoeshoe from other leading figures of the Ngwane nation who want to destroy him, because they say Moshoeshoe is getting too big for his britches and he's becoming too wealthy in animals, and therefore they want to overwhelm him. Ultimately, Moshoeshoe realizes that he's between a rock and a hard place. And so he sends tribute to Shaka.
Okay.
In the hope that Shaka will himself become the weapon to undermine Matiwane and to give him more space. And fortunately, Moshoeshoe is wily enough to succeed, because he sends tribute to Shaka, which is accepted. They've established a relationship. He claims to have sent then another batch of tribute, which doesn't make it to Shaka, with his emissaries saying, "We tried to bring you more tribute, but Matiwani got to us first, and he's taken everything."
Interesting.
And so this enrages Shaka, who then sends his brother Dingaan with a large impi, and they are then the ones who destroy Matiwani in 1828. And Matiwani, already feeling that he has no future in the Caledon River Valley, then makes a second huge blunder by going south across the Orange River and resides among the Tembu there. Now, there is nothing wrong with the Tembu as such, but they had already established friendly relations with the colonial government in the Cape.
Okay.
And when Matiwani's people come there, obviously with a lot of violence, they plead for assistance. And at that time, the Cape government realizes that indeed there are these upheavals going on, and it's likely to impact ever further into territory where the settlers are living. So they pay heed to the Tembu and send a regiment or two and end up overwhelming Matiwani because, of course, he's not familiar with, or very familiar with, horses, guns, cannon, and so forth. So then he gets decimated, comes back as a refugee. Moshoeshoe, in his great style, offers him sanctuary. But you must understand that these Ngwane who and the Nguni who had been transformed during the Difaqane viewed themselves as a far superior race. And for any of them to accept some kind of refuge under a Mosotho, under these people from the interior, was just almost an insult. Almost an insult. And so Matiwani foolishly goes back to Natal, where he's promptly executed by the Zulu.
Very brilliant strategy, isn't it? Does this show something about Moshoeshoe's character and his ability to...
You see, Moshoeshoe, we often paint him as the peacemaker, as the great diplomat, blah, 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 blah. This is true, but it's not the whole story. Because from the beginning, Moshoeshoe, he got the name Moshoeshoe, Moshoeshoe I, because he had completely stripped another clan or another chiefdom of all of its herd of cattle. Now, this is not the one and only time he did that. He was building up his people in the same way that other leaders were doing so, by raiding cattle, raiding women and children. These were common tactics of the time. And so, although, yes, he became this wise diplomat which everyone praises, at the same time, he was also very wily, and the common methods of his time were also used by him. There was even a time the Morosi of the Baputi was at one time, let's say, kidnapped or held hostage by Moshoeshoe's brothers and brought to Tababusiu in order to coerce the Baputi into an alliance. Now, as it turned out, this alliance became mutually beneficial and very long-lasting.
Friendship by force.
Friendship by force. And so we must recognize that Moshoeshoe is more complex than we usually give him credit for.
There is the warrior, but there's also this ability to notice that Shaka is there, is very powerful, And I do see this in noticing also the power of the British and then navigating that.
You see, this you're right. Moshoeshoe is a student. He's a man who collects intelligence. Through the very alliance with Morosi and the Baputi, he's first introduced to horses and guns. Now, of course, at the beginning, they don't know how to use these, but gradually with time, they do. And what helped him tremendously was that he starts getting this communication from the Eastern Cape, from refugees, or Caledon River refugees, let's call them, who tell him of this different life which they're experiencing. Moshomi's favorite wife, Madiapollo, is even said to have sent an emissary to Thabo Bosiu. His name was Tamanamani. And he came, and according to the stories which were recorded, he held a pizzo there in which he explained some of these new influences, including the introduction of Christianity. Now, what people might have understood by this, we have no idea, because they didn't really have a reference point. But then the following year, we think this was probably in 1831. In 1832, a Griqua hunter from Philippolis in the southwest, what is now the southwestern Free State, called Adam Kok, in his own interests, he's a hunter, he roams widely, comes into the Caledon River Valley and is recognized, is identified, and is brought to Moshoeshoe, who then interrogates him through an interpreter as to what's happening at Philippolis.
We are almost to the end of this conversation. But before we get there, if this episode has made you think, made you question, made you proud of where you came from, that is exactly what we set out to do. Siriti Samakharane exists to make sure this nation does not forget itself. Through heritage masterclasses, archival restoration, digital archiving, and community work across the Greater Makharane region, we are building something that will outlast all of us. Be part of it. Check links in the description. Back to Stephen Gill.
And again, he's told about these missionaries. He's also aware that Coloureds has got horses and guns, and even negotiates to buy at least one or two weapons. Mm. So later on, for example, in 1883, during the 50th anniversary of the Protestant mission in Lesotho, there was this dialogue and debate which was recorded in the newspaper Leselinyana about whether Moshoeshoe was interested in the gospel or in guns. Mm. And of course, the whole debate is framed in such a way that in fact it's very false. Because for Moshoeshoe, there was never a trade-off. It was not either or.
It was Bible and guns.
It was both and. Bible and guns. He was persuaded by Coloureds that the missionaries in Philippolis, who were from the London Missionary Society, were true friends of the African people, and that they had powerful friends in Cape Town and London who could help to influence things positively for them. And this is one reason why the Griqua at Philippolis, under Adam Kok, who had originally been, let's say, themselves inclined toward raiding and piracy and so forth, gradually became far more stable, far more astute at using the politics, the emerging politics of the region, to their own benefit. And so Coloureds made Moshoeshoe aware of these things. And this motivated Moshoeshoe to say, then I too need representatives of these missions. I too need them to be close to me, to help me to build this nation and maneuver in these changing times.
So the concept of Baruti who come to help build the nation is based on acknowledgement of the power that they come with, in the power, not only in firepower, but also the myth they bring, the gospel, the literacy. What exactly is the point that's distinguishing the missionaries from any other? Why not try to forge alliances with the British at that time? And why the missionaries? Why these
Why the
Christians?
Because at that time, Dr. John Phillip, who was the superintendent of the London Missionary Society in Cape Town, had tremendous political influence with the very British authorities. And so it was said that if you align yourself and partner with the missionaries, then ultimately he also will become a force for your protection and your salvation. I don't mean salvation in spiritual terms, but in material terms. And because of the input which Moshoeshoe had been receiving through the Caledon River refugees, let's say Madiapolo, because I think we have to give credit that these stories have some historical basis. But then also through the experience with Adam Kok, it's true Moshoeshoe is gambling. He doesn't know these people personally, but he's heard enough that he knows that if he's going to side with someone, if he's going to develop a new partnership, these are prime candidates. Fair enough. The partnership might backfire. It may fail. But it's better than just waiting. Better than waiting for what he must have already realized were the settlers moving ever further north. And he knew, again, from the very feedback from these people, that these were also people who were very dangerous and who could also undermine his vision for his people. So much better to be proactive and to seek out alliances with people who could help him rather than to wait almost for the inevitable to take place.
Well, what was his attitude towards their ideas, their strange religion, their philosophies? They believe in God.
Moshoeshoe was, how can we say? He looked at things with both a short, medium, and long-term perspective. He tried to connect his understanding of the world with that of the missionaries. Obviously, some of the things that the missionaries taught were very odd and very, perhaps even repellent to him. But because he had hope in this partnership, and particularly because of the character of Eugene Cassilis and the friendship that they were able to form, he was able, in a sense, to sift, maybe to sometimes swallow, to sometimes just ignore aspects of the missionary teaching and gospel which he didn't agree with. But at the same time, to allow them to work among his people and, let's say, work as kind of almost yeast or leaven, that this thing would sort itself out over time. He wasn't going to dictate. Very, very different from Mzilikazi, for example. Mzilikazi was said to be the greatest friend of the missionary Robert Moffat, and even allowed missionaries to come and live among his people. But not a single member of the Ndebele nation ever became a Christian during Mzilikazi's time, because there was almost a silent agreement that if anybody converted, they would be killed. So Mzilikazi pretended to be the friend of mission, when in fact he was not at all. Whereas Moshoeshoe had this far more flexible and open-ended approach, where he didn't need to control and dictate everything. He could allow certain processes to gain momentum and to adapt over time.
Is this coming from his temperament as a person to tolerate still being a man of war and at the same time being curious? What makes Moshoeshoe? I'm trying to get to understand the person.
I think, as I say, this was an experiment. It wasn't guaranteed from the beginning. It grew incrementally over time, and I suppose the results, again, it's wrong to overemphasize the role or the personality of Cassilis. But in the same way that Moshoeshoe was curious and open to possibilities, I believe Cassilis was also, in terms of missionary work, also very broad-minded and able to grasp the possibilities of this opening with Moshoeshoe. After all, Cassilis and his colleagues were not supposed to come to the Basotho. They didn't even know about the Basotho. They were supposed to go north to work among the Tswana. But at the time, Mzilikazi had just overrun the very areas where they were supposed to work. And so when they arrived at Philippolis, they met the very same Adam Kok, the hunter, who said, "Look, if you're stranded, there's another opportunity available. I've just come recently from this king of the mountain, and he said he desires to have missionaries." And so Cassilis and his colleagues said, "My God, maybe this is the door that God is opening to us. Let us not resist." And so Coloureds brought them to Thabo Bosiu, and as they say, the rest is history. But it must be emphasized, it was an experiment on both sides. Nobody could be sure that this was going to pan out and become fruitful or mutually fruitful, but ultimately it did.
How did the relationship between Cassilis and Moshoeshoe develop?
You know, what's surprising is that Moshoeshoe was so enthusiastic about the possibilities of this partnership that at the very beginning he wanted to even move to Morija himself. Ultimately, it didn't work out for reasons which I don't want to explore at this point. So he sent his two senior sons, Letsie and Molapo, to live in Morija. And then, over the next few years, relations between Moshoeshoe and Cassilis developed to such an extent that Cassilis decided, I'm moving to Thabo Bosiu to be next to Moshoeshoe. And so here's a man who was prepared to separate himself from his missionary colleagues and devote himself almost full time to that national project of Moshoeshoe, because by then, 3-4 years into their stay in Lesotho, Cassilis was deeply embedded, let's say, within this vision of a Basotho, a larger Basotho nation, which thrived and prospered, and was at the same time gradually incorporating missionary ideas, literacy, and so forth.
Morija forms part of this vision. And I think several times today you mentioned the word vision. And what in your understanding really is Moshoeshoe's vision?
As I said before, it's easy to idealize people like Mohlomi, people like Moshoeshoe. We must realize that they lived in historical periods where certain customs and practices were dominant, certain mindsets. Over time, some of them came to learn that there were alternatives, and that some of these alternatives could greatly enhance their prospects for success. Because what did Moshoeshoe want for his people? Well, first of all, they wanted security. Secondly, they wanted wealth, or they wanted economic power. They wanted to grow the nation and grow its wealth so that people were not impoverished, or they could mitigate the impact of drought and other natural phenomenon. I mean, when we come to the gun war, it'll be interesting. Not only do you have periods of tremendous downpours, flooded rivers, soggy and boggy fields, you also have periods of drought where there's hardly a blade of grass to be found. And how do animals survive under these kind of conditions? So Moshoeshoe, he wanted peace and stability. He wanted economic security. He wanted a growing and centralized, let's call it monarchy, or political system, where he, his allies, his brothers, his sons would dominate. He wanted, in terms of security, to master horses and guns. Because unlike the Zulu, he was not prepared to have a standing army, and he believed that the future did not rest on huge, overwhelming numbers, but on mobile, technologically equipped cavalrymen, if we may call them that. And so he was not looking east. He was looking west and south and realizing this is where the future is. I have to adapt, or our nation is going to succumb to these forces. And then finally, he realized that however peculiar, however challenging the ideas and some of the methods that the missionaries brought, he realized from the beginning that things like literacy were absolutely essential. In fact, he himself tried to learn how to read and write. But unfortunately, because of age and so forth, he didn't succeed. But he greatly encouraged his people to learn these kind of skills because he could see that in future, he said, if you can put something on a piece of paper and then pass that piece of paper around the room, and people can all see and read and understand the same story, he felt that this would even help to perpetuate his own teachings and his own approach to life, because he realized that it was not now enough memory. Memory was not enough. We needed to have written records which would then perpetuate these things into the future. And he saw that there was great power in that.
If you stayed until the end of this conversation, thank you. You already understand why this work matters. This is the SSM podcast series, brought to you by Makgwarane Heritage and Tourism Network. We work with communities, youth, educators, and heritage professionals to preserve the living culture of the Makgwarane region, because we believe the future of this nation cannot be built on a forgotten past. To get involved, to learn more, to support what we are doing, visit us at www.makgwarane.com. Please check the links in the description. Share this episode, send it to someone who needs to hear it, subscribe, hit that notification button, it really helps, and stay in touch with us. My name is Ansel. Until next time.